morning, and let me also welcome you very warmly to this seminar. My name is Hege Hoff, and I will give you an introduction to the EEA Agreement, a very general one, the scope of the agreement and the institutional setup. And all my points will be picked up on and elaborated later on during the presentations here today. There will be some repetition and overlap, but maybe sometimes that is also very useful. So before I start, since we actually are the hosts of this seminar, let me introduce you to the EFTA Secretariat. And as you maybe already have realized, we do in fact have three different duty stations. Our headquarters in Geneva, where you will also find our colleagues that are working with the negotiations of free trade agreements. Also, we have a statistical office located in Luxembourg together with Eurostat. And you will meet our colleague Volker later on today, who will talk about this cooperation. And then here in Brussels, we are the largest part of the EFTA Secretariat. And today we are in our new building, which we share with our sister organizations, the Financial Mechanism Office and the EFTA Surveillance Authority. And you will meet many of our colleagues from those organizations later on today. So, what is it that we do here in the Secretariat in Brussels? Well, what we do is that we assist the EEA EFTA member states to the best of our ability in all their work related to incorporation of new legal acts into the EEA Agreement. That means that we follow the legal acts all the way from proposal on the EU side until they have been incorporated into the EEA Agreement. This is what we call the EEA process. And as you will understand, this is quite a big operation, actually, and it takes a lot of work to have this process running according to intention, so to say. We also have an important role in coordinating work between our three EEA EFTA states, and we would also coordinate between the EFTA states and our EU counterparts. And our main counterpart on the EU side is the EU's External Action Service. And we are very happy that we, in fact, will have Angelina Eichhorst from the EES here today to give their perspective of our EEA cooperation. And also we are a secretariat for the EEA advisory bodies, and you will learn more about them later on today. So let's dive into the EEA Agreement. What is the EEA Agreement? Well, as you know, it's an agreement between the EU and the three EEA EFTA states, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. It entered into force in 1994. The objective of the agreement you can find in the agreement itself. It establishes a dynamic and homogeneous European economic area based on common rules and equal conditions of competition, and also providing for the adequate means of enforcement and judicial level. So to put it in short, it extends the internal market to the three participating EEA EFTA states, bringing us all 30 states together in a common market. And for this to happen, you will see that the EEA, this objective is underpinned by two core principles. First, it's a dynamic agreement, which means that new legislation is continuously incorporated into the EEA agreement. A second core principle is that all legislation in the EEA agreement, it cannot only be the same on paper. We need to enforce and apply the rules and regulation in the same manner. And that is why we have an institutional setup for surveillance and judicial litigation. So, these are the objectives and principles. Let's look how these objectives and principles are brought into the content of the EEA agreement, the scope of the EEA agreement. So, the central scope of the EEA agreement is the 4 freedoms, as you will know. There should be no unlawful restrictions on the free movement of goods, services, and capital persons within the EEA. That is the core of the agreement. To support and to make sure that these rules are not hindered by other restrictive actions by states or companies, we have other common rules to prevent undertakings from agreeing on prices or abuse a dominant position or hinder unlawful state aid that distort competition from the member states, and we have rules on public procurement. Also, through the EEA agreement, our member states participate in other policy areas, EU policy areas, which fall outside the core of the internal market, but it supports the internal market. And this would be areas such as the environment or consumer protection. Also, through the EEA agreement, you will learn and see that we do have a big and encompassing cooperation in programs. I'm sure many of you, for instance, have benefited from the Erasmus program. And this you will hear more about later on today by one of my colleagues, so I will not go into detail. Neither will I go into the very important fact that through the EEA agreement, we contribute extensively to the reduction of economic and social disparities in Europe. So, this was very rapidly and in short the material scope of the EEA agreement. But of course, we need to go one step further. We need to have institutions and bodies and a decision-making process to run this agreement. And this is what we will look at now. But before doing so, I think it is important to No, I was too quick. We cannot go into the institutional setup before we have had a look into what the EEA agreement does not cover, to put it into perspective. As the scope of the EEA agreement is broad, you will also realize that there are very important policy areas of EU cooperation that our agreement does not cover, such as the customs union or the common trade policy, and other areas you can see listed here. Whereas we do say, however, that fisheries policy and agriculture policy falls outside the scope of the EEA agreement. That is true. We need to mention that the EEA agreement has been extended to cover EU food safety and veterinary rules. And this is actually, in amount of legislative acts, the biggest area covered by the EEA agreement. And it means that, for instance, there are also no border checks, veterinary border checks, so that, for instance, Norwegian seafood does not need to be stopped for border control when it travels all the way through Europe. And this cooperation has also had a tremendous impact on how we organize food safety and the veterinary area in our member states. And also just to illustrate the extensive European integration that our member states actually enact in, we have also bilateral agreements with the EU, but that falls outside the scope of the EEA agreement, such as the Schengen Agreement. This brings me back to where I started. I was a little bit too eager. Now we're back at the institutional setup of the EEA agreement. Before we look at the model itself, I think it's worthwhile mentioning that EEA cooperation, the EU and EFTA cooperation are two different models of cooperation. The EU model is characterized by supranationality and transfer of competence and sovereignty, whereas the EFTA model is based on a classical intergovernmental cooperation. And there was no transfer of competence to the EFTA institutions before the EEA agreement, and no common policies as in the EU. And the EU institutions have defined roles in the decision-making process, whereas decisions in EFTA cooperation are taken by consensus between the governments. And of course, it has always been a major concern and object in EU cooperation to preserve the decision-making autonomy of the EU, whereas an important concern as regards EFTA cooperation has been to preserve sovereignty. So, in order to fulfill the objectives of the EEA agreement and at the same time reconcile these two models of cooperation, we have this institutional setup. It's commonly referred to as the EEA II Pillar Structure. What this refers to is that EEA cooperation takes place in two different pillars. We have the EFTA pillar on one side with its institutions. We have the EU pillar on the other side with its institutions, and also some common institutions that you see here in the middle that has been set up under the EEA agreement. So you will see that the EEA agreement does not transfer competence to EU institutions. Decision-making competences rest in the EFTA pillar. I realize this model, it's daunting in a way, so I will not go into detail, but what it is that it is unique and also quite elaborate. Maybe I shouldn't say sophisticated, but it is quite, elaborate, as I said. The highest governing body of the EEA cooperation is the EEA Council. They meet on political level twice a year to discuss the development of the agreement and certain important EEA aspects. And then as you see in the middle there, the EEA Joint Committee, that is the most important joint body for decision making, because that is where the parties come together to agree on adoption of new legal acts, incorporation of new legal acts into the EEA agreement. And then you see the EFTA Standing Committee, and that is the highest governing body of the EFTA states, and there the EFTA ambassadors come together to discuss and form positions before they go into the decision-making phase in the EEA Joint Committee. I will not go into detail here because later today you will meet the Norwegian ambassador to the EU, Rolf Einar Fife, who is also the chair of the EFTA Standing Committee, and he will tell you more about the functions of these bodies. And what you will also realize that outside this model, and before a matter is brought up in the EFTA Standing Committee, a lot of work has taken place on expert level, in expert group, in working groups, in national authorities, to prepare everything for incorporation. And that is what my colleague Audun will tell you all about later on. So this part, you could say, is what caters for the dynamic part of the EEA agreement. But then we have also institutions to make sure that we have this homogeneous internal market, the homogeneous EEA, that the rules are enforced and applied in the same way. And that is why we have set up the EFTA Surveillance Authority. They make sure that our member states implement their EEA obligations and that rules are enforced as they should be and interpreted as they should be. And to this effect, the EFTA Surveillance Authority has the same competences as the EU Commission would have towards the EU member states. We will have a colleague from the EFTA Surveillance Authority who will tell you more about the duties and tasks and work of the Surveillance Authority. And finally, also with the same purpose, we have the EFTA Court that has been set up in Luxembourg. And the court will then resolve any issues between the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the member states, and also when our national member states and national courts in our member states are dealing with questions related to the EEA agreement, they can submit questions for advice by the EFTA court. And a colleague from the EFTA court will inform you more about the court later on today. And finally, we have what we call the advisory bodies, the Parliamentary Committee and the Consultative Committee, representing parliamentarians and our social and economical partners, so that they can come together and discuss important issues and also have a say in our EEA work and give their opinion. Finally, we have also established a forum for local and regional authorities. So this was the institutional setup of the EEA agreement. And ever since the EEA agreement entered into force, this setup has remained unchanged. Whereas on the EU side, we have seen a vast development in new areas of cooperation, new forms of cooperation. And notably, we have seen the growth of agencies and authorities, and they have new competence also in areas covered by the internal market. So it has been important for us to take part and in this cooperation and in these institutions, such as the financial supervisory authorities. And our structure does not foresee these agencies, but what I can say and what you will learn more about today is that even though it has raised certain challenges, we have always found solutions actually to safeguard our member states' participation. And this is why we like to say that the EEA agreement is robust and flexible. To finish my little presentation, I would like to show you this little photo. It is taken when we marked the 25th anniversary of the EEA agreement, when EU leaders, all EU leaders and our 3 member states came together to mark the anniversary. And I think this photo, it illustrates in a very nice way the magnitude of our EEA cooperation and the importance of it, and the commitment that all parties share to this agreement. Final reflection, also looking at it, is that today, after what we've been through, the times we have been through, how many they are and how close they stand together, and they're not even wearing masks. So, but let it be like an inspiration and a reflection of more normal times, which we hope soon will come, and meaning also that next time we have this seminar, that all of you can come and visit us in Brussels in this great building. So, I will leave it at this. I will thank you for your attention and give the floor to my colleague Audun. Thank you.